All right, so first question. In your opinion, how would you best describe or define the core?
So yeah, I suppose that's a challenging one to win with, because of how I think traditionally, as it's probably been described as your torso, your midsection, so the area or region of your body from your pelvis and probably up to your rib cage, where your abdominal muscles would attach. So probably previously that's what I would have said. However, now, because I hopefully understand the way movement integrates and feeds back to the brain, which then allows you to control movement, it's probably a bit of a bigger region, and I would think of the core being definitely including the pelvis, but probably the whole of the upper trunk. So yeah, I would say pelvis to upper ribs, neck area.
Nice. So then, just to build off that, how would you describe the function of the core in an athletic context?
I think there's probably lots of functions for it. I think the one I sort of alluded to there is I think it's a feedback feedback system to the body to recognize where the body is, the limbs of the body in sort of space relative to one another. So I think firstly, one of the functions is a feedback mechanism, and then probably primarily it's to transmit forces from the extremities to people, to objects, or to project the center mass through space. So as an example, if we're going to hit a tennis ball with a racket, we want to be able to use the core to transmit forces from the lower body that are generated up the chain into the hand to be able to sort of move the racket, therefore resisting forces and therefore transmitting forces. I would say is a big function. I think also, sorry, my cat's getting in the way. I think on top of that, I think to absorb forces. So if we look at jumping and landing, where perhaps there's been an ACL or a lower body injury, perhaps the trunk as an adaptive response there helps move to reposition other limbs or the center of mass to distribute force away from a potentially weaker, more at-risk area. So you see that in, for example, in broad jumps, if somebody's more bent over and then there's more flexion in the spine. I think this is, again, a bit of a feedback loop to be able to control the body to reduce torque around about a segment of the body that's at higher risk. Mm-hmm. So I would say in that situation, it's got a force absorption, but not a direct force absorption function. Mm-hmm. I don't think, although, so my background comes from originally the sport of judo. People or judo athletes will develop force slightly different depending on probably their physical characteristics, but also their style of fighting on the throws. So quite often you'll have athletes or coaches would want athletes to do, rotational work from the core, where they would try to fix the pelvis, for example, like in a split squat position or in a seated position to try to generate power from the core. I never saw the core as a power generator, but more as that ability to transmit forces. So even if you're on your knees throwing somebody, I still see the core as a function of being able to transmit rotational forces coming from the hip through to the hands. So yeah, pretty much a transmitter.
Mm-hmm. Nice. That's a good answer. So moving on a little bit, do you currently prescribe any direct and specific core exercises with your athletes?
I do. Obviously going what you said, so direct core exercise, we do a lot of lateral work, so your side planks. The level of athlete I work with at the moment, they're not full-time, so we have to choose quite carefully how much training volume we just put into them and where's the biggest bang for our buck. But we know that non-contact ACLs are quite a big thing, particularly in heavier female athletes, so it's rugby that I work with. So we do quite a lot of lateral work, so side plank holds, and then trying to resist movement in side plank positions to improve that, the ability to have good capacity, but also strength, so that if they plant a foot to change direction, they're not increasing the torque on their knee by falling over in that direction, and they're able to keep a good position or good pelvic position. So that's a lot of the work that we do. For the scrummaging athletes, so for the forwards, we do quite a lot of lower back holds and isometric holds, to try to keep that position so that when they extend from their knees, from their hips, that's transmitted through their trunk to their shoulders and then into the opponents. So we do for them a lot of isometric holds. Apart from that, those would be the main things that we actually do, mostly due to time constraints and trying to hit the trunk with other exercises.
Okay. So mainly isometric in terms of the direct kind of core training?
Yeah, mostly isometric work, yeah.
Nice. Would there ever be a time when you would do more of a, maybe, I guess we can call it dynamic, whether it's trunk flexion or trunk rotation or something like that? Would there be a time where you do that if you had the time and with the
there is with a couple of athletes. We have done. There is one at the moment who she's the hooker, so she throws in the line out. And one thing that I've tried to develop with her is so she does from a bear crawl position, she does a rollout to try and get isometric strength in her trunk. And one of the reasons we do rollouts with her is I'm trying to improve the maximum force capacity of her like anterior trunk. She not pairs in a sequence, but one of the other exercises she does is an overhead medicine ball throw. But I try to have it rebound off the wall to try to start building in a stretch shortening cycle into the anterior core, because the distance she can throw the ball is really poor and it limits what tactics we can use in our line out throwing. So I'm trying to use the isometric anterior core exercises to improve the maximum force, particularly in a long lever position, and then overhead medicine ball throws against the wall where it rebounds off. She then quickly has to catch it and then throw again to try to develop that stretch shortening cycle sort of qualities. So there's some that we do use dynamic exercises for. I suppose the other one that we use with our scrum halves is a heavy medicine ball rotated throw. However, I find that it's difficult to get a technical model to both satisfy what the athlete is trying to do on the pitch and then the best way of training rotation, or whether we want to isolate or overload rotation of the trunk. And I find that those things then become quite messy when there's a coach in the gym environment and a player who's perhaps not the most experienced. And then it becomes, you want to do the medicine ball throw like you do your scrum throw. And then it becomes, well, is it a core exercise for rotational strength, or is it just a special developmental exercise to throw the ball further? Yeah. So we have done a little bit of that before, but it wasn't specifically to target the rotational component of the trunk. It was more as a blend of an element of that, but there was also the element of just a special developmental exercises for throwing the ball further out the scrum.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. Is there any reason you don't use more, I guess we can call them traditional core exercises, so maybe sit-ups, leg raises, Russian twists, things like that in your programs?
Not really. I suppose part of where I think the rate limiters for the athletes are, I don't think is in dynamic exercises. I think the muscle actions that we do in sport, as I said, I think mostly with the athletes I work with at the moment is about transmitting forces from the lower body to the upper body. So we can get higher forces with isometric exercises. So then doing those dynamic exercises, we're going to be not being able to use as much force. I also think there's a lot of flexion extension that goes on in the spine anyway. Going to clear out in the ruck position, on the ground when they have to place the ball. There's already a lot of loaded flexion extension exercises. So if I was to add those things in, I can't see what rate limit of performance they'd be improving. On the other side of it, I have done like I've done CrossFit and hammered those things out loads. But I find they actually probably rob training volume from fatigue of the load. That's perhaps specific to me in my current capacity, but I tend to find they rob more training volume than they probably add to.
Nice. All right, kind of building off that question then. So we'll talk about the exercises you're mentioning, so those isometrics. Do you believe direct and specific core training will transfer and improve athletic or sports performance?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, so then to build off that, what kind of athletic abilities do you see that transferring to best?
I think first of all, improving the athletes' availability, so helping them to not get injured so they can be exposed to their sport more. As I said before, I think non-contact ACL injuries are a big one, particularly in female team sports. So being able to control the pelvis position, the trunk position, and therefore the lever length going around like the knee joint when you're changing direction. I think being able to control your trunk in those situations and being strong enough that when the sort of centrifugal force wants to spit you out, that you can keep a good trunk position leaning in to project yourself out. So first of all, I think just injury prevention wise, I also think being able to run, that being able to have a good trunk position, particularly pelvis position, is going to allow you to, when you're either trying to run fast or be more economical, allow you to get a higher thigh block so that you then got more distance to push down into the ground so you can produce more force. So you can obviously run either faster or with higher economy because you're in a better position. I think so pelvis position there is really important. Yeah, so I think those would be some of the main ones. I think from a throwing sport point of view, I think being able to, as I said before, transmit forces from strong leg up through the trunk into your hands to be able to project somebody, to be able to punch somebody, to be able to throw an implement. So yeah, I think if your trunk is your weak link and your legs are super strong, your shoulders and upper body are super strong, the body won't, at least in my philosophy, your body won't allow you to have access to that power if it feels that you're at risk. So it'll reduce activation in other parts of the body to reduce injury risk.
Mm-hmm. Nice. So building off that then, so do you believe those direct and specific core exercises work better than traditional forms of training? So barbell training, sprinting, jumping, for improving those aspects?
I think it depends. And the things I think it depends on are a little bit of the athlete's makeup. So if an athlete's got naturally strong legs, then potentially that's not where their rate limiter is, and they've got a long trunk, for example, then there's potential there that there's going to be more forces they've got to overcome. So that athlete might benefit from direct core work more than another athlete with long legs and a short torso, for example. I think movement control, I believe, is really specific to the velocity of the movement. So I think it is all well and good being able to control your trunk and your pelvis position in a static situation. But I also think that if then, like as an example, if our athlete might have anterior pelvic tilt and then we control it and they can do that in a static situation, but then we go and have them run and jump and then their pelvis position again tilts anteriorly so they can't get a high thigh block or they've got a big heel recovery or whatever it is. I think then in those situations we need to train them in a dynamic situation to build awareness and motor control at those velocities. So I think in those situations doing some specific skill-based work is important with a focus on core positioning.
Mm-hmm. Nice. So then next question, but you kind of already touched on this. So do you believe direct core training can decrease the chance for future injuries? And you kind of mentioned it did. So with like non-contact ACL and stuff like that, do you think there's any other kind of injuries that direct core training can specifically help mitigate?
Yeah, I think I think if you've got poor proprioception around about your trunk muscles, you're going to get more deviation and joint positioning off your vertebrae, particularly if your lumbar spine. So therefore, I think those micro movements can then again send feedback to the brain that either says, "Oh, I don't like these movements. I'm going to give pain as an output," and then that's going to decrease muscle activation or just my ability to work at any sort of intensity. So I think doing your if athletes do experience joint pain or whatnot, doing your McGill big three, where we're looking at motor control and we're looking at stability around about the core to decrease like movement deviations, that's going to then it's going to allow somebody to work at higher power, but it's obviously then going to allow somebody to spend more time thinking about their sport, get exposed to their sport, and decrease injury potential that way.
Mm-hmm. Nice. So then, similar kind of question, do you believe those direct and specific core exercises would work better than more traditional forms of training for decreasing injury risk?
Do they work better? I suppose it depends on the injury we're talking about. That's a good question.
And some of them are more difficult to answer.
Yeah.
They're meant to be a bit tricky, but it's just to get you to kind of think deeply, I guess, about that question. So I guess we want to frame it that non-contact ACL you've mentioned a few times, so we can maybe talk about that one. Do you think the isometric core work you're doing with your athletes works better than maybe like lower body strengthening or sprint training or change of direction work for non-contact ACL?
Again, I think it possibly depends on where the weakest link is for the athlete, and you've got a continuum of things that they need to do at certain times. I think in that fundamental capacity of the trunk, in a simple situation, one can teach people what more optimal and more desirable joint positions are, but they can also improve like the endurance or the force characteristics, so that then when you come into having to change direction, you're limited by your skill and coordination in that task, and not necessarily the isolated capacity of the trunk. So I think in that situation, yeah, absolutely. For somebody that's new and they've not got the capacity, improving that is going to lead to improvements and reduce the risk of an ACL that way. I feel that somebody who's already got sufficient capacity, and trying to define that is probably pretty difficult, but where they do, you think, all right, they're able to hold a side plank really static, really well controlled with a good pelvis position with no shaking for 2 minutes. They can do off a glute ham bench, they can hold for between 30 and 60 seconds in an open chain situation. Yeah, I think they've got good, relative to other people, they've got good capacity. I now think they need to learn to use that skill and change of direction, because I don't think they're limited by the lateral isometric force of the trunk. So with that athlete, I'm going to try and work on the skill component of being able to keep good position. So it kind of depends. What I don't think is right is that if an athlete has good levels of trunk, if we use that example, good levels of trunk strength and trunk work capacity, just keep trying to push that on further and further and further, and not spending time on the skill, I think that's wrong.
So then, would it be safe to say, like, whatever that threshold of strength capacity is, if the athlete's below that, it's going to have an effect on injury and performance, but once you kind of get past that threshold, probably looked at different exercises and training methods?
Yeah, I would say that the amount of training time for each element would sway to be more specific. I think like probably an important thing to touch on as well is just that sometimes injuries might not manifest in like a short time period, and it's just that gradual misuse of something, whether it's disc degeneration or joint wear in the joint capsule of the hip from being anterior rotated, you get labral issues. I think a lot of those things don't come to light until later on, and you think if we'd improved trunk capacity earlier, therefore we gave the body a reason to move more desirable than less desirable, we could have prolonged the availability of that athlete as they get older. Whereas I think sometimes because you have, like I have this situation with a more novice coach at the moment where a few athletes are moving with, I would say, less desirable mechanics in an exercise, but they're injury free. They're also 19 years old. Like they can tolerate a little bit of lumbar flexion and lose control of that. Absolutely. They won't get injured today doing that. If we now start loading them up after they get above squatting 40 kilos, and now they're squatting 120 kilos in 4 years' time, and I've done squatting twice a week with those mechanics, I think now we're going to see a different picture. So I do think that doing those exercises will longer term reduce injury likelihood.
Nice. So next question, in your opinion, do you believe direct and specific core training offers any unique benefits over other forms of training? So again, barbell training, sprinting, jumping.
I think one of the things it offers is the ability to overload the core or overload the trunk because of like moment arms and lever lengths. So whereas when you're squatting, obviously, if we use squat or deadlift, because they're two that are touted as, you know, good exercise and you have high trunk activation. I think then as soon as you go in a horizontal position where you can, let's say, move your arms above your head, so then the lever length is longer, you can put more force through while reducing forces at other parts of the body. So potentially you can get a bigger increase in trunk capacity, like strength, isometric rate of force development without having to tax the other elements of the body to the same degree. So I think that's probably like one benefit that you can get from it. I'm trying to think, I've not thought of it from another point of view. I think that would be a main one, that you can, you know, get injury reduction benefits, you can get force transmission benefits without actually having to train force transmission with the legs and the arms. So you can reduce the overall cost of exercise.
Nice. So then kind of moving directions a little bit, do you think there's ever a situation where directly training the core could have a negative effect? So either on performance or in relation to injury risk?
Where it would have a negative effect. I think training the trunk, like this is going to be a stupid, but stating the obvious bit, training the trunk incorrectly, and by incorrectly I mean you're in a poor position, your athlete's not in control of it, there's movement deviations that are occurring without the athlete deliberately trying to cause that movement. I think there you can probably get deviations in the joint positions, and then that over time can cause wear and tear. I think like a classic example would be like your leg raise exercise where you're jamming somebody into lordosis, they've got a massive anterior tilt. If you're adding that volume of training on top of somebody's also scrummaging and also lifting overhead in a line out, so they're going into sort of lower back hyperextension anyway, I wouldn't see that as a good use of training time, and potentially adds it stresses the body in another way that it perhaps doesn't need to, and then that can be the straw that breaks the camel's back. So I could see that being negative impact. Again, I think that people getting tight hip flexors or overworked hip flexors from poor pelvic position when they're doing exercises can then reduce someone's sprint performance or running performance because their trunk is tired, their hip flexors are fatigued, so they change their mechanics, which then ingrains that habit. But I'm probably quite fortunate I don't see a lot of that, because that's not really how I program things, and most people I work with don't program, but I could see that. I suppose there's things I'm not keen on are things like Russian twists. Like I see that like from the sport of judo, that gets prescribed an awful lot for rotational strength, and I'm just not 100% sure where it fits, whether you're trying to control upper body rotation, if the legs are free to move, is it just a counterbalance that you're not really doing any work, you're just allowing the reflex of your legs to pop out. Those sort of things, I just think that's wasted training time, which then has a fatigue effect, which then contributes to your overall training load, and then can topple it that way.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if there's anything that I would say massively increase injury rather than just overall fatigue or bad mechanics.
Kind of like indirectly affecting training volume and stuff.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Cool. So now I want to kind of talk about how you're assessing the core. So first question, do you ever assess the core in any of your training programs?
Yeah, so the only real formal trunk assessment we do is work capacity. So we do a 2-minute time cap of front plank and then side plank and then hold off a glute hand bench. Probably the biggest reasons for them are more operational than other things. We traditionally, where I work, profiling or screening sits in the physiotherapy department, and the list of things that come to be profiled are just absolutely massive. So trying to, when I started, it was they did all of the assessments off the glute ham raise machine, but there was only one machine, and we've got a squad of 40 people. So it would just take forever. There was no quality control behind it. So how far does somebody have to deviate before you call the test if they're holding, for example, a prone position on a glute ham bench? If you got like a mark or a horizontal marker that if they drop below, you give them one warning. If they do it again, give them a second warning. It's really difficult. Or I found that when other people are controlling it, was really difficult. So we've gone down to simple side plank and then front plank and then supine hold on the glute ham bench for lower back endurance or for trunk endurance. They're the only ones that we do at the moment. I do think there's potential to look more at maximal force capacity, like capabilities, but something I like, particularly for athletes in scrum position. I don't know how much you know about rugby, but on the front of the scrum, the two props have two different jobs. The tight head is being lifted up by two athletes, so their anterior trunk maximal force capabilities to keep their chest down to be able to push is huge. And then conversely, the loose head on the other side, they're obviously against the opposition tight head. They're trying to lift up, so they've got to have strong upper back, lower back to lift up. We don't assess those maximal abilities whatsoever, but they're clearly determinants of successful scrummaging. So one thing I'm just a little bit resistant to is inventing assessments, because I think we then get into the issue of trying to test the reliability, and I just don't have the time to do it. But I would like to look at maximal like trunk like capabilities.
Mm-hmm. Nice, that's interesting. Is there a reason for the 2-minute time cap, or is that just kind of what was picked?
That's originally, I think the medical department had 3 minutes, and then per person it was taking 12 minutes to test, and then in a 40-person squad. So I think the main reason it got reduced was, well, we kind of think this, but there's very poor science on any of that sort of stuff. It's more, it gets called general capacity. They just need good general capacity, but it's like, okay, where's 2 minutes come from? It's more like an operational issue than we think that if somebody can hold on their side for 2 minutes, then they've got good endurance. Like,
yeah. And that's what I'm realizing by doing my lit review, going through all this research. It's like most of it's just made up.
well, it's the same. Like a big one that I have, and I get there's probably a bit more evidence, but it's like we look at lower limb work capacity. So, for example, I suppose this maybe does relate to a little bit of some stuff if some people use like a dynamic trunk exercise. But if you look at, for example, a dynamic calf raise or heel raise, the limiting factor there ends up being metabolic fatigue. So then you fatigue because of dynamic contraction, which obviously has a byproduct of lactate. And even though that doesn't cause the fatigue, probably the pH of the muscle changes. It's dynamic metabolic fatigue is why you fail on that. Whereas if you look at the function of the calf when you're sprinting or when you're doing repeated efforts, it's much more isometric, eccentric action that's going on. You're not failing because of a buildup of metabolic byproducts. You're failing because of a decrease in activation due to fatigue. So why is it that we're testing someone's ability or their hamstring ability to do a hip bridge for 30 repetitions and they fail because of metabolic fatigue, when you say